The world was in transition at the end of the 1980s. The American automotive industry was bleeding silently, its past glories dissolving amid recalls, environmental regulations, and a market increasingly inclined toward Japanese technology. Chrysler, then a faltering giant, sought redemption that seemed impossible. However, amid the gray concrete of Detroit, something was brewing in the shadows. It wasn't a project, but an ancient roar, a primitive instinct that knew nothing of aerodynamics, comfort, or convenience. It was the desire to create a car that was pure combustion and muscle. And that desire would take shape in a monster called the Dodge Viper RT/10. It all started with a bold idea from Bob Lutz, then vice president of Chrysler. What if we made a modern Shelby Cobra? Not a tribute, but a brutal rebirth of the raw spirit of that car. The proposal seemed absurd, an American sports car with no roof, no four-wheel drive, no ABS brakes, no airbags, and no commitment to comfort. But Lutz didn't want to please the market. He wanted a battle cry. To do so, he called on Carroll Shelby, the creator of the original Cobra, who despite his advanced age still had the spark of rebellion in his eyes. Shelby not only approved the concept, but also became directly involved in the project. The engineering was handled by Team Viper, an internal Chrysler task force made up of young, hungry engineers willing to do anything to create something that went against all the trends of the moment. The concept was presented to the public in 1989 at the Detroit Auto Show. What emerged there did not look like a car. It was a red aberration with muscular lines, an endless hood, and a total absence of technological features. It looked more like a racing beast than a street car. The reaction was instantaneous. The Viper was not only desired, it was feared. People knew it wasn't for everyone. It was a car for snake charmers, not ordinary drivers. But turning concept into reality would be a Herculean challenge. To feed the beast, Chrysler turned to Lamborghini, which it owned at the time, to develop a V10 engine from a truck V8 block. The result was a 400 horsepower powerhouse with monstrous torque delivered brutally with every turn of the wheel. The chassis was tubular with a fiberglass body. The car had no hardtop or conventional windows. It was an invitation to pure brutality. The Viper RT/10 was officially launched in 1992. Its birth was like a blood ritual, an offering to the gods of speed. There was no automatic transmission, no assistance. It was just man, machine, and asphalt. In an era of well-behaved cars, it was a threat. In a time of control, it was chaos. Thus began the legend. The engineering of the Dodge Viper RT/10 was not a careful construction. It was a battle. Every decision made by the Team Viper engineers was a punch in the face of industry logic. There was no room for compromise, and every attempt to include technology that would soften the experience was seen as a betrayal of the original concept. This car would be a snake without scales, ready to sink its fangs into anyone who dared to underestimate it. The engine, the heart of the beast, was born from a Dodge LA truck V8 block. With the help of Lamborghini, which was then operating under Chrysler, the block was lengthened and reinforced to house 10 cylinders lined up like soldiers on parade. The resulting power plant delivered 400 horsepower at 5,200 RPM and 485 Newton meters of torque at 4,200 RPM. It wasn't just power, it was brutality in liquid form. The 6-speed manual transmission supplied by Tremec was dry, heavy, almost agricultural in its operation. Shifting gears in the Viper wasn't an action, it was a pact. The driver was responsible for every mistake, every slip, every oversteer. There was no traction control, no ABS, no airbag. The steering wheel communicated everything, every grain of asphalt, every imperfection, every threat. The body was molded from fiberglass and resin panels. The tubular steel chassis was a maze of reinforcements designed to contain the power of the V10. The Viper weighed about 3,280 pounds, a low number considering the colossal engine it housed. The weight distribution was slightly rearward, which contributed to a nervous rear end, always on the verge of collapse if provoked violently. The independent four-wheel suspension was calibrated for the track, not for comfort. The Viper didn't take corners, it attacked them. The steering was not power-assisted in the first units. This meant that, in slow maneuvers, the car required physical strength. But at high speeds, it delivered a level of visceral precision. The brakes, initially ventilated discs without ABS, did their job competently, but demanded respect. A miscalculated braking maneuver could spell the end. The performance was wild, from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 4.5 seconds, with a top speed of 165 miles per hour. But numbers were irrelevant in the face of the experience. Driving the Viper was like being on the edge of a precipice at all times. It roared, shook, and spat heat from the sides. There was no hardtop, just a removable canvas hood. The windows were plastic inserts. The interior was claustrophobic, minimalist, with simple leather seats and analog instruments. The cabin boiled, literally. The heat from the engine and side exhausts invaded the cockpit, turning long drives into sessions of thermal torture. But that was part of the package. The Viper wasn't a car to take someone from A to B. It was a test of will, a challenge to the driver's courage. And even so, or perhaps because of it, it won over the most restless hearts. It was the car that made no apologies. That explained nothing. A symbol of an America that preferred to roar rather than negotiate. A machine made to race and to kill. The arrival of the Dodge Viper RT/10 on U.S. streets in 1992 was like unleashing a prehistoric beast in the middle of civilization. There was no context. It didn't fit in. It was like seeing a bloodthirsty predator being released in a shopping mall. The contrast was violent, and the impact was immediate. In an era of increasingly technological cars with power steering, adaptive suspension, and climate-controlled interiors, the Viper was an affront. Not because it lacked features, but because of its deliberate disregard for comfort. It was as if the car laughed at the idea of convenience. It was created to humiliate mediocre drivers, and it did so with frightening efficiency. On the streets, its performance was as visceral as promised. The V10 roared with savage violence, and all it took was a little aggressive pressure on the accelerator for the rear to break out like a whip. There was no middle ground. The car demanded constant attention. Small mistakes, such as accelerating in the wrong gear or braking too late, could result in unexpected spins, runoffs, or collisions. The Viper was a practical lesson in respecting the laws of physics. Many automotive journalists who tested the RT/10 at the time reported the same thing. It was the most difficult car ever released by an American automaker in series production. Its ability to accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in less than 4.5 seconds was as impressive as it was terrifying. The lateral force in corners was brutal but inconsistent. The Viper didn't follow trajectories. It threatened to follow them. Every corner was a negotiation. Every straight was a chance to get lost in torque. The steering, unassisted in early versions, made drivers' arms burn during maneuvers. But at high speeds, it offered a direct link to the asphalt, a sensory extension between tires and brain. The stiff suspension transmitted every bump in the road like a stab, which made the Viper absolutely hostile on urban routes or poorly paved streets. The noise inside the car was deafening. Between the roar of the engine, the sound of the wind rushing through the space left by the thin canvas roof, and the scorching heat rising from the side exhausts, the cabin felt more like the inside of a boiler. It was uncomfortable, it was dirty, it was perfect, because it was honest. The Viper RT/10 became a cult object. Classic muscle car owners saw it as the legitimate heir. Weekend drivers loved it for the constant challenge, but it also generated fear. Insurance companies began to classify the model as high risk. Independent repair shops reported an increase in the number of cars damaged by loss of control. It was a car that would kill if treated like a toy. Police in several cities reported seizures of Vipers involved in illegal street racing. There was no way to disguise a car like that. Wherever it went, it left a trail of its roar. It was like hearing thunder before a storm. On the streets of Los Angeles, Detroit, or Miami, it quickly became a legend. A predator painted in bright red, slithering down the avenues like a snake between the feet of the crowd. The Viper wasn't just fast, it was dangerous, and that was its soul. Every legend born on the edge of reason is bound to face the judgment of the world. And the Dodge Viper RT/10, with its utter disregard for the rules, attracted not only admiration, but also the stern gaze of those who write the rules. It was inevitable. A car so brutal, so reckless, could not escape unscathed from institutional repression and the consequences of its own venom. Over time, the reports began to pile up. Accidents, fatal crashes, loss of control at moderate speeds. The lack of assistance systems such as ABS brakes, stability control, or electronic traction control made the Viper a latent danger. It demanded more than skill. It demanded almost military discipline. And many, seduced by its looks and promise of raw power, were not prepared to drive it. On highways such as California's Pacific Coast Highway or the open roads of Texas, accidents involving the Viper began to attract attention. In many cases, the causes were the same: excessive speed, loss of control in corners, skidding caused by sudden acceleration. The car was unforgiving to the inexperienced, and the price was paid in blood and twisted metal. The media quickly went from fascination to criticism. The Viper was portrayed as a killing machine, a dinosaur without modern brakes, a car too dangerous for the streets. Some publications called for its withdrawal from the market. Others questioned how Chrysler had managed to get a vehicle without airbags or active safety systems approved in a country increasingly focused on consumer protection. Insurance companies reacted with numbers. The accident rate involving the Viper was disproportionately high. Some states began charging exorbitant rates to insure the model, while other insurers simply refused to cover it. Dealerships began requiring buyers to sign liability waivers, warning of the extreme risk of driving the vehicle. Even within Chrysler itself, voices began to be raised. The initial commercial success had been intense, but it would not last if the car became a symbol of irresponsibility. There was internal pressure to tone down the Viper, make it more civilized, more ordinary. But that would have undermined the essence of the project. It was not created to obey. It was created to challenge. When asked about the Viper's lack of safety, Carroll Shelby replied coldly, "Safety isn't my job. My job is speed." It was a statement that sealed the car's fate as an icon, but also as a target. The phrase made headlines, sparked protests, and ignited discussions about ethics in automotive engineering. Organizations such as the NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, began investigating the model. Although the Viper was technically within the parameters required for approval, its reputation grew as a rolling public health hazard. Some cities, such as New York and Chicago, considered restrictions on the model's circulation in urban areas. It was the beginning of a war. The car that had been launched as a battle cry was now seen as a real threat. The Viper had conquered the world with torque and roar, but now it faced the judgment of reason. And the modern world, even if fascinated, does not tolerate for long what it cannot control. As the years passed and the market reorganized itself around efficiency, connectivity, and artificial intelligence on wheels, the Dodge Viper RT/10 remained immobile, not physically, but in spirit. Like a fiery fossil from an era when risk was accepted and speed was unapologetic, it stood still in time. And in that immobility, it flourished as a symbol. In American culture, few cars have managed to generate such a dense mythology. The Viper wasn't just fast, it was dangerous. It wasn't a superhero car, it was the car of anti-heroes. In movies, TV shows, and video games, it was rarely portrayed as an ally of good. Instead, it appeared as the machine of outlaws, lone vigilantes, and men in conflict with the world. It had an aggressive visual presence and a mechanical sound of war. On television, the Viper even had its own series, Viper, launched in 1994, where a modified RT/10 was transformed into a high-tech combat vehicle. The irony was evident. America's most primitive car portrayed as a futuristic artifact. But even there, the myth was intact. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a character. It was an idea. In movies, its silhouette and throaty sound made for fleeting but powerful appearances. In video games, such as Gran Turismo, Need for Speed, and Forza Motorsport, the Viper was an almost instinctive choice for players who didn't want to win easily. They wanted to win violently. Its behavior on the track, even digitally, was always more difficult to master. This made it a symbol of overcoming adversity. Over time, the original RT/10 became a collector's item, not because of its luxury, but because of its challenge. Its market value fluctuated, but its aura grew. It was the car that belonged to no one. Those who bought it knew it wasn't transportation, it was a pact. At enthusiast gatherings, the Viper occupied a place apart, respected not as an engineering masterpiece, but as a legendary creature, a survivor. On social media, enthusiast and collector channels began to revere the model. Retrospective tests showed veteran journalists trying to contain smiles and sweat as they recalled the brutality of the V10. The world had changed, but the Viper remained there, like a glorious scar on the history of the American automotive industry. Even its flaws became virtues. The lack of traction control came to be seen as authenticity. The heavy steering as direct communication, the heat in the cabin as a baptism by fire. Over time, the Viper achieved what no other contemporary American car has ever achieved, the status of a necessary monster. In the end, the Viper RT/10 was not just a car, it was a rebellion on wheels, a declaration of independence against passive engineering, a reminder engraved in fire that for some men and women, to truly live is to live on the edge. And for those people, the Viper still roars. The Dodge Viper RT/10 was not a car for everyone. It never was. It was not created to please, to serve, to obey. It was forged as a weapon, as a scream, as a brutal reminder that speed in its purest form is not a number. It is an emotion, a slow burn of fear, transformed into adrenaline. A pact between man and machine, sealed not with comfort, but with courage. Today, When every new car seems to come packaged with promises of assistance, intelligence, and autonomous driving, the Viper remains there, like a specter, a scar that refuses to heal. It's what remains of a time when driving was an aggressive art, a battle between ego and the road. It's a living reminder that there are those who prefer uncomfortable truth to polished lies. And you who have made it this far, know. You know that there is something ancestral about the feeling of holding a steering wheel that responds with fury. That there is a raw beauty in feeling the car vibrate like an animal under unstable control. The Viper is not dead. It lives in every acceleration without traction control, in every turn taken with your heart in your throat. It lives in your desire for more, for something real. If that snake roared inside you today, don't ignore it. Feed it. Share this story. Enjoy the video. Subscribe to the channel, and if you can, support this work. Because telling stories like the Viper's is keeping alive the flame of an era that refuses to be extinguished. An era where fear and passion shared the same seat. The Viper isn't just a car, it's a cry for freedom, and that cry still echoes.